Hi, my name is Angela Vanderka, and welcome to my Zoom session. We have a small group here live, but I know some of you are going to watch this after the fact, so we're recording. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with a little bit of a discussion about how to select items for a still life and how to pick a color scheme. And then we'll talk about the paint choices, how I'm going to translate those ideas into painting. And maybe we'll do a little bit of a start of a painting demo too. So I'm going to just crack along. I'm going to share my screen here with you guys. I'm going to start with just looking at some different teacups and different still lifes that I've painted in the past and kind of talk about what went wrong and so that I can help you guys learn. So let's start with this one. And please, my folks who are here live, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions as we go along. So the first one here is a painting I did a long time ago, over a decade for sure. I went through a beer stage because I'm originally from Canada and I thought, oh, I don't really drink beer. I'm not a big beer drinker, but I feel this kinship with my countrymen who love a good beer. So I thought I'd paint them instead. Maybe this was my nod to my Canadian heritage. And most Canadians will probably despise me for saying that, but anyway, I've got this teacup, or sorry, this glass, and I'm kind of liking some of the things that are going on with it. I like the shadows. I like that I cut one of the shadows with the bottle cap, but it doesn't feel right, does it? I mean, there's something wrong with it. And when I started looking at it, what I realized is this oval in the top of the glass is wrong. So I went in and made an edit, and look at the biggest difference that can make. Just a little bit of a shift of the oval to make it a little bit more rounded and a little less wonky can make all the difference. So I'm just going to go back and forth between them so you can see as soon as I smooth out that bottom edge. So one of the things I want to talk to you guys about today is how to see it, how to know what's going on, because sometimes when I'm painting and I'm like in this stage here, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking everything looks pretty good, but why is this bothering me so much? There are obviously a few things that are wrong with this painting, but this is the main one for me. So I'll talk to you about how I found that. So self-critiquing really is a little bit of what I'm going to talk about and how to create ovals that are going to be effective. In terms of my teacup series, I've painted many teacups over the years. Now, this was a little bit more of an overt nod to my Canadian heritage because I grew up drinking tea with my family, and every night after dinner, we'd have tea. And I have this great collection of teacups from grandmothers, great grandmothers, aunts, friends, and now I've collected a few of them myself as well. So over the years, I've painted a number of teacups in a number of different ways, stacked on the table with tea in them. This one I kind of like because I was looking for that heart shape that this particular handle made with the shadow. So playing around with the light, looking at objects that are behind it. And I use a lot of flowers with my teacups. I also use tea itself and what color is that tea? How does everything around it fit in with the color of the tea and the color of the teacup? And what are the patterns going on? Whether I'm going to actually paint every little part of the pattern or skip some of it because it's a lot of work to put in those patterns. And so I like to simplify them. When I do my painting demo at Acrylics University, I'm planning something very simple without a lot of pattern because it's an essentials day. So that's my plan for Acrylics Live. But as you can see, I really jump in on pattern. I really love pattern. So maybe today's demo, we'll talk a little bit about pattern in a teacup and how you can create the effect of pattern layered with the tea. So sometimes there's pattern inside the cup, not as often. I very much look for cups like this one that have a very nice pattern inside so I can look down on it a little bit as if I'm sitting having a cup of tea. For me, that's part of the experience of drinking tea is sitting over that tea, feeling the heat coming up, looking at this beautiful china. And let's be honest, I mean, this is very much a privilege to be able to drink tea in a china teacup. I recognize that privilege. Even being able to be an artist feels like a privilege, and so there's like a paying honor to yourself as well as your heritage and looking at something like a still life and saying, okay, how am I going to use these objects to convey some sort of emotion? For me, it's nostalgia and it's comfort. For some folks, it might say something else. And depending on what you throw in with the teacup, you could make a political message, you could make a commentary on society, you could also just like myself just say, I want to just put out what makes me feel good into the world and share that. So everybody has a different way of looking at it, and that's totally unique and individual. That's where you find your own voice. So thinking about that, I'm going to share my iPad screen with you guys right now because what I want to do is I want to show you some of my thought process behind planning a demo. And in this circumstance, I'm going to talk about how I'm going to plan out my demo for Acrylic Live coming up in March. It's the Acrylic Live 2025. So I've got this teacup here that I really like. I've never painted it before, in part because the color is kind of odd. Let me get rid of this paper first. I mean, it's a cute little demi-tasse teacup. It's really pretty. But it's kind of an odd shade of kind of a peachy pink. It's not really my color, but I like what's happening with the pattern, and it's also fairly simplistic, which I thought was good for Acrylic Live because I'm going to be doing an essentials day. So I thought, let's paint this one, but geez, Louise, now I've got a challenge of what is going to go with this cup because I'm not just painting this cup, I'm painting the area around it. And right now, looking at on a wooden tabletop, I'm not crazy about the wood, this yellowy kind of wood with this color. So you saw I had some papers. I'll take a bunch of different colored sheets and put them down and say, okay, does this work? These are too matchy. I don't think that that's going to work. So I'm going to put that aside. Having a bunch of colored paper is handy to have because you can really quickly kind of say what works. I mean, this isn't terrible, but it's not great. I don't love it. There's a lot of heat. We've got this warm peach and the red. I think it's too much personally. And you might disagree with me, and that's okay. You can disagree with me. This is more brown, but it's a little bit more of a grayer brown. I like this grayer brown better than this yellowy brown. This works a little bit better. So it's telling me I want something cool, I think, next to this heat of the pink. I'm talking a little bit about color temperature. That's really subjective in some ways. It's kind of what you feel. White could work. I mean, I could do it on white, but boring. Let's move on. Let me see. How about like a purple? Maybe that gives a lot of contrast, or green. Green and red are complementary colors, meaning they're opposite of each other on the color wheel. So that could be interesting, but that particular green just doesn't do it for me. My favorite color these days is blue. So let's try a blue. Oh, that's not terrible. Although what it's doing is it's dulling down the pink, actually. The minute I put that on the blue, look at how warm this pink looks right now. I don't know if you're seeing this too, but as soon as I put this blue down, this blue is so vibrant, this is becoming the neutral. And I really don't want that to happen.
Angela, is that happening because blue and orange are opposites?
Yeah, just like
Okay.
with the green and the red, but the green,
Mm-hmm.
I think because you're right, this is more orangey
Mm-hmm.
than it is red or pink. So yes, because they're opposites and because this is a more saturated blue and this is a very dull orangey pink, peachy color, it doesn't really work. This is going to become the more saturated color. And I
Mm-hmm.
really want to keep the teacup as my focal point. Focal point just means where I want everybody to look first. So I think that's why that's happening, and nothing lives in a vacuum. Everything's about relationships. So how colors talk to each other. This is a charcoal gray, and this is working better for me than the blue was. But it still needs something happier. So I think I'm gonna keep this here for a minute. And I'm going to take a look at some other colors besides the gray because I might want to put in some flowers or some greenery. I'm not sure. And maybe a tablecloth or two. Like what about a blue? I love this color of blue. But again, I think it's too saturated. I mean, if I put it just with the cup, although the cup doesn't get as dull as it was with the other blue, maybe because this leans more greenish. I'm not sure, but I don't think I'd love it. I don't know. I feel like I'm going down the wrong path. It's all a guessing game. I mean, really, you could go any direction you wanted to. What about pattern? That's too much pattern, I think. If I was going to do pattern, it'd probably be small pattern. And honestly, again, I'm doing this for a simplistic demo at Acrylic Live, so I really don't want anything too busy. I'm going to keep it pretty simple. That's kind of nice-ish, but it would have to be in small amounts, I think, if I was going to use that color of green. So mostly gray, maybe green in the background. Maybe if I put it back here, so barely overlaps. I'm just playing around with it and trying to see what I feel works best for me. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I don't mind this kind of direction that I'm going in. I don't think this is the right green. I think what I need is a grayer green because again, I don't want to compete. I want this pink to stand out from everything else. So what I'm looking at is I'm thinking again, because this is a dull pink, if it was a hot pink, I could get away with some other color that could compete with it, but it's competing with this green right now. So I think what I want is a sage green, maybe like a something like sagebrush or eucalyptus. I think it might be the way I'll go. And when I do my demo at the end of March at Acrylic Live, I'll go buy fresh flowers for the demo so that I'll have fresh flowers. And I do have some dried flowers and some plastic flowers downstairs in my studio that I can put with it, but I always paint from real flowers. Okay, moving on. Let me think about other accessories like spoons. So now I've got to decide, do I want, actually, I'm going to put the green back in there for a minute, even though this isn't the green. I don't think that's the green I want to use. It's still going to give me an idea. Do I want silver as my metal of choice? Is close to the gray. Does it work with the green and the pink? I'm not sure. Let me try a gold instead. Let's do it with the cup. Personally, instantly, I'm attracted to the gold. I don't know what you guys think, but I that's just my personal preference. I think the gold is picking up a lot of warmth, especially in the reflected light of the cup. And so if I had this spoon near my cup somehow, it's going to really pick up those pinks and bring them into some of the cools that I'm going to do in the background. So I'm kind of leaning towards gold here. So gold instead of silver. I've got the pink of a dull kind of peach color, which is an orangey pink. For my cup, I'm going to have a gray. Maybe I'll use like a slate ground or a chalkboard underneath of this, and then a kind of a green. So I'm thinking, this is how I think about my still life before I even do it. There's a lot of planning for me, and I find that if I do this type of planning, what happens is that I'll get a better result. So if I just sit down and paint whatever I see, that's fine too. I mean, that's a great exercise. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think for me, the planning stage, thinking about colors that are going to work harmoniously is a really big part of it. And going back to those pictures I showed you, I really thought I was thoughtful about the color combinations that I put into all of those. And even the color of the tea is going to matter. I have some turmeric tea that's very yellow. Maybe that would look interesting in this teacup with the gold. But I've also got other teas that are very brownish or kind of grayish brown, and some that are really vibrant orange. So I'll have to play with the tea itself. I'll make a couple of cups of tea and pour them in and figure out which tea I want to use too. So all of those accessories, I'm very mindful about them. It's not willy-nilly. It's really about planning and thinking ahead. So thinking about all of that, like how will I arrange these items together? I mean, I don't have all the things I'm going to need at this moment because I haven't gone and bought the flowers. But what I do a lot of times, even before I even have all the elements, is I will grab my sketchbook. I always have a sketchbook on me. Now, this sketchbook here is not my preferred sketchbook. This one's just a nature sketch. It's a high quality multimedia sketchbook, very thick and solid. So it's got really nice stiff pages, good for painting in. But it's not my preferred sketchbook because it is so thick. The pages are so stiff, they're cardstock, that it can be heavy in my backpack. And when I travel, I prefer to use and I don't think I have one. Oh, I do have one on me. This is my preferred sketchbook whenever I travel. It's called the Super Deluxe by B Paper, and I can easily create sketches. I can paint in it. Um, I always do this kind of planning before I ever paint. I'll sit down and I'll think about, so you're seeing some really messy work here, but this is kind of how I think about my series if I'm working on a series of shows. This is from years ago, 2017, a show I did at Cole Gallery in Edmonds. and I literally sketched out how I wanted to crop the reference material. So then I said, oh no, I don't like that one. Yes, I like this one. I might do little sketches as I go. Color planning, kind of figuring out which tube of paint is going to make the mixes I need for a particular piece. And again, more. So this sketchbook, even though it's not as thick as the one I'm demoing in today, the Super Deluxe is great for acrylic as well as I think I've got some gouache in here. So it's a great sketchbook for making notes on when I have a painting, how I want to lay it out, and then even like make little color notes. And I always write down in a shorthand which colors I'm testing. We'll do that together here as I plan for this demo. So on this sketchbook here right now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a really heavy pencil. This is a 7B graphite, and I'm going to start doing some sketching here. And I would not normally use a 7B pencil for sketching, although I'm not opposed to it. I'm doing this with a 7B so you can see it well on the camera here. But normally I might use a pen, actually. I might even use like a Sharpie so I can't erase it. But sometimes I'll just use a regular pencil that I can erase. And I do have eraser here because nobody's perfect. So I know for a fact that I want to work square. And why did I choose square? Here's my canvas that I'm going to use actually. It's a 1.5 inch deep canvas stretch, and it's a Frederick's 12 by 12 canvas. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's hard to see from here. And I might be able to zoom in a little bit on the texture. It's got a very fine texture. I don't know if you can see the texture, but it's not super like rough. It's actually very, very fine. I'm just going to focus my camera. So that I don't get a ton of texture with the weave. A lot of times, you know, you'll see a sale at Michael's or, and I don't want to disparage anybody, but you know, if you see a sale at a craft store of any type with canvas and it's really cheap canvas, what happens sometimes is that weave is so thick and it's basically woven fabric. So you'll get this like you'll see the little threads going in and out. And what it does is it creates a lot of texture in your painting. You see that, and it can be hard to create detail. So this one is not super textured, it's fairly smooth. They've obviously done a couple of coats of gesso. That's something you can do if you have a cheap canvas and you don't like the texture. Do 3, 4, 5 coats of gesso over it, letting it dry in between each coat and kind of obscure some of the texture. So there's still a little bit, but not too much. Kind of that balance. Okay, so I know I want to work square, so I'm just going to do some thumbnails. My thumbnails are typically 2 inches wide-ish, usually not much more, and I am not worried about detail. So I'm going to think about this little cup here, and I don't want to worry about making a perfect rendering, but all I want to do is get an idea of when I start painting this, how do I want it? Do I want my cup to be front and center? Let's just think, okay, what if I just do it like this? And have the handle off to the right. Maybe I'll have the spoon sitting down beside it, kind of cutting off to the edge of the paper. And then maybe I'll have a rose or two and some greenery in the background. Okay, so if I'm going to do a sketch in my sketchbook, what I'm trying to look for in terms of design is number one, my focal point. For me, my focal point is going to be this cup. I know that for a fact right now. That's what I want to focus on is the cup. Then I've got to look at values. So now I got to think, okay, where are my shadows going to go? If I have the light source, let's say I have it here. Let's start it here. And what I'll actually do is I'll actually set this up in my studio after I do these sketches to see if it translates the way I think it's going to. So I know there's probably going to be a shadow that's going to come off the spoon, and I know there's going to be a shadow coming off of the cup. And I'm going to just fill them in as black as I can. I'm just going to try and do this in black and white-ish to start. I'm not going to do any detail. I know that this part of the teacup is for sure going to be shadowed inside the teacup. And I know that there's going to be some light catching here, and the rest of this will be in shadow. So I'll just make that dark. And then the cup itself is going to cast a shadow, probably something like this. Okay, so right now what I've got is a lot of shadow going on down here. I have to think about what's going to go up here too, in part because I want it to be balanced. This is my focal point. I want the eye to go here first. I think what I want to do is I would want to make something dark on this side where I've got light, this little triangle of light. I'd want this to be dark. So if I'm going to put a flower in, I think that flower needs to go here instead. And then everything else can be grayed out. So maybe I'll just do shades of gray over here. And then I can try it a different way. I'll just go in and sketch it a couple of different ways. Maybe I want to look down on the cup more. Have the handle here. You only see a part of the front and a part of that. Maybe then the spoon is going to go on top of that saucer. And then again, maybe I'll change my light source. Maybe now I'll think about what if I put the light source right behind it? That would cast a shadow like this. And the way, if any of you are wondering like why, how would I know where the shadow is going to be cast? I mean, I'm just assuming, of course, but also I've practiced this many times. I've painted these so many times. I kind of have an idea of where the shadow is going to be. If you're not sure, get a light, like get one little light. It could just be a flashlight even, and set it up on a table with your reference material and play with it. See what it's going to do. I suspect that there's going to be a shadow here from the teacup, the back of the teacup, and then this part of the tea would be in light. And what I kind of like about this, honestly, is that there is this light and dark. In fact, it almost looks like a little person. I mean, that's kind of interesting. And then maybe everything's backlit here. I don't know where my flowers would go. Maybe I'd have flowers cutting off on the side and you'd see some greenery kind of coming off the edges. I'm not sure. But this is what I'll do. I'll sit here and I'll sketch kind of ideas so that when I go down to my studio, or if you were to go to your kitchen and use your counter or your table out in the living room, whatever, wherever you're deciding to set things up, you have your reference of, okay, I kind of like the idea of maybe trying backlighting, or maybe I prefer the lighting coming off to the side. I'm kind of making some ideas. This is like my thought process. I've already figured out kind of what kind of colors I might want to use. Now I'm trying to get an idea of how I might want to set up the objects. And this also helps me when I need to go to the grocery store or to the flower shop and buy some tools to go with it. If I don't have any spoons, or if I want maybe some little sugar cubes, maybe I need to go buy sugar cubes. If I decide, oh, you know what, there's some negative space here I don't like, let's look at maybe some sugar cubes or some cookies that I'm going to put in the side and then eat the rest of them. Flowers that are going to go here that I'm going to use for my still life. And hopefully, if they don't die, I'll be able to put them in a vase and enjoy them for the rest of the week. These are my thought processes. So I just kind of put them down on paper first so that then I can go and shop effectively and hopefully, you know, be a little bit more precise with what I need and not have to do a bunch of trips. Next, I might do a color study. Let's say I like this design kind of looking down on the cup with the spoon kind of resting on it. Well, now what I can do is I can actually take some markers, for example, or some colored pencils and say, okay, I've got my cup and I know it's pink. It's white on the inside. It's pretty much just pink on the outside. That's a lot of pink. And I know that my um, spoon is going to be gold, so I'm just going to put in some goldish tones and color it in. I'm just using markers for this process. Then I'm going to think, okay, now we talked about what kind of colors go around it and look nice. So I could literally do a bunch of these little thumbnails and try some different color combinations with these yellowy golds and pinks. So I'll just do a couple of them. I don't spend any more time than this. I know it looks really messy, and that's okay. This is just planning. It doesn't need to be a perfect, precise picture. But in terms of creating something original and thinking about the color combinations I want that I'm going to like, hopefully, and the way I lay things out, I've got to maybe do a little bit of experimentation. So one of the colors I talked about was like maybe trying a sage greenish color. with a gray background. So what if I took some sage green and just threw in the idea of some greenery around it, and then used my gray for my tabletop. And I'm not doing any shadows on this right now because I'm not worried about that. I'm just worried about color relationships. There's that idea. Or what if I went with more of a blue? Let's try a blue instead, going around. And again, I worry about the competition of the blue. Maybe I'll try a little bit lighter blue in there. In my past, when I started painting, I used a lot of vibrant colors all the time in everything. And what I've found now is I really like to use vibrant color, but also have a place for the eye to rest with a neutral. And that's a big part of the reason why I'm kind of going towards this gray and a grade green over the blue, although I don't hate this color combination either. This is quite lovely, as long as it didn't compete too much. But what would that blue be? Would it be the tablecloth or maybe a napkin? Or maybe I could find some flowers that are blue with some whites and stuff that could work in there. I mean, that's an option. But then I've also got to think about my tea, what color I want my tea to be. Do I want it to be an orange or do I want it to be a yellow color instead? Or maybe both. Maybe I do a little bit of both. Maybe I make sure that it's got a little bit of a yellowy tint with some orange in it. Or it could even have some red. I mean, there's some great teas that have some reds in them, and I think that would look really cool in this one actually. If I had some red, maybe like in the shadowy areas. Ooh, actually, that's kind of interesting. Now, suddenly, this has become more appealing to me than this was before. And only because I like this combination of all the grayish greens and grays around it. The pink will be the hero, but then I could have a little bit of a reddish tone in my tea with the orange. And I kind of like that. So it's really just subjective. It's really about playing, sketching, and deciding what I like and what I think might work, hopefully. Okay, so now that I've done some of that, and let's say I've decided, okay, you know what? I am going to go for this. I'm tempted on this one, but I think this one I can see because I really like the idea of doing some sagey greens around. And again, remember this color is much kind of duller than this pink. So this pink would have worked perfectly with turquoise. But we already played around with putting turquoise with this color, and because it's kind of an orangey, uh, dull, kind of dirty pink, the peachy color, I don't think it would work as well. I don't have this color in a marker. So this is where colored pencils might come in better because you can definitely layer them. But this gives me a general idea. And I think when I looked at the fabrics, that green, there was something about the green that I liked. I think I could just dull it down, have that orangey tea with some reds and the pinks. So now I got to figure out what colors I need to have on my palette. Obviously, I'm going to have a white. I'm showing you M. Graham paint. This is my favorite brand of paint. Golden is a great brand too. Liquitex is okay if you use Liquitex Professional only. Liquitex Basics is very inexpensive, and I know when we're first starting out painting, it's really tempting to just use the cheapest paint. But if it was me and you were asking my opinion, I would always say to people, go for the most expensive paint you can afford. So M. Graham, for example, not as expensive as Golden, but maybe not as easy to find, so you have to order it online. Um, Maybe Golden is the best one for you. Get the 5 or 6 up to 7 colors that you're going to use the most and just stick with those. And that way you're getting great quality paint, and it makes a difference because the lower quality of the paint, the more paint you have to use to make the same thing you would do with less of the expensive paint. And these paints, they can last for years, if not decades. So let me share my iPad here again, and I'm going to go over my color choices and how I pick which tubes. So white is a standard. I'm always going to have white in my palette. I'm going to put that aside because we know I'm going to use it. And I'm just going to put this aside here for a second. Next, I'm going to think, okay, what yellow do I want to use? So there's different yellows out there, of course, right? Like you've got some warm yellows, some cool yellows. This is an example of a cool yellow, cadmium yellow light. This is an example of a warm yellow. This is an Indian yellow. This is very transparent. This cadmium yellow light is very opaque. So for me, and another example of this would be, so there's Indian yellow, there's what other warm yellows? We've got yellow ochre, which is a very browny kind of yellow, typically used more in landscapes or portraits. But for still life, I'm going to want something that's going to be able to really amp up the color as necessary and lighten it as needed. Because if I just use white, my colors are all going to look chalky. So I could use Indian yellow, it's very warm, but it's not going to make as clean a color mixes in some circumstances because it is so dark, or so warm. I want a cool color and I prefer a opaque yellow. So if you have like a azo yellow or a lemon yellow, that would work too. It's just not as opaque. And the reason I like my light yellow, my light cool yellow to be opaque is because it will help me cover up some of the dark colors that are going on underneath as I'm layering my paint. So with acrylic paint, typically I'll think darks go down first and then I layer my lighter colors on top of it, with my very last color being white and maybe a little bit of yellow mixed in. So I like those colors that go on top to be really opaque personally. Then I gotta think, okay, what about reds? Remember, we have this really kind of creepy peachy color. How am I gonna mix that color? So I can look at my reds and I can say, okay, again, we've got warm and cool versions of color. We've got a cool, this is transparent, so cool, transparent, red. Quinacridone, any of the quinacridone colors are always going to be transparent, so that's a helpful reminder. Any of the cadmium colors are always going to be opaque. So cadmium red light is a very orangey tomato red. Quinacridone rose is going to be a very cool cherry red. And this one is translucent. And I like my darker colors to be a little more translucent. So for me, it's Quin Rose. Now, Quin Rose is specific to M. Graham. So if you don't have this color, don't stress. You can also use primary magenta. Golden makes primary magenta. You can use alizarin crimson. That's another color. I don't personally use alizarin crimson only because it is not light fast. It will lose its color over time. You can buy a permanent alizarin crimson, and I would recommend that. But for if you're just learning, don't stress about that. Just get alizarin crimson. It will work just fine. Just know down the road, if you want paintings to last, if you're selling them, you should use a light fast color. I'm going to use quinacridone rose, but feel free to use alizarin crimson. Quinacridone red would work. Also, you could use that primary magenta, any cool translucent red. So I'm going to put away my cadmium red light because I just don't think this would ever work well to make these colors. Cadmium red light is a great color on its own, but it doesn't make the best color mixes unless you use something like this would be great for maybe like really vibrant reds and mixed with some blues or mixed with yellow ochre for some really fun, funky oranges. My blues, I want to think about which blue I want to use. I've got two different blues here. I've got a warm, what I consider a warm blue. This is controversial. Everybody has a different opinion about color temperature, just to confuse you. This is a warm blue. This is a cool blue, ultramarine blue. I want to mix my blacks. I'm not going to add black to this mixture, so I'm going to add a brown, whether it's burnt umber, which is an opaque brown, or a transparent red iron oxide, which is actually what I've been playing with more lately. You can pick which brown you're going to use, but I'm using the burnt umber, and when I mix ultramarine and burnt umber, I get black. If I mix cerulean blue and burnt umber, I get kind of a greenish tone because there's some yellow in this color. So I'm going to take that one out. I know this is the color palette pretty much that I'm going to use. And either I'm going to use the burnt umber or I'm going to use the transparent red iron oxide, which is a similar color to the burnt umber. It's just a little more reddish and it's very translucent, where the burnt umber is fairly opaque and can be heavy. So this can make great blacks. And what the other great thing about using this color combination for my blacks is when I add the white, I can make powerful grays that either are more bluish or that are more brownish. So that will really give me some power with the grays that I use in this teacup. And to make that color, we'll have to play with it a little bit. So using these colors, I'm going to try and see if I can mix that tone and start doing some color examples. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my cup up here so you can still see it. I'll put my colors aside. I'm going to grab my little sketchbook and let's just start doing some color notes in here first. This is playing around with color theory and also with, I just have to grab a palette here. I'm so sorry, you guys. I've got my water, I've got my brushes, I've got my paint, but I didn't grab my palette, so let me just grab that. Here it is. Okay, so I've got a palette here. I'm going to put this right here. This is just a paper palette. It's a pad of plasticized paper. You could use waxed paper if you'd rather, or if you like a stay wet palette, you can use that too. Whatever works best for you. That's what I say go for. I'm going to take my lid off my water. And I'm going to grab my brushes, which I've just got over here on the side. I like to keep them nice and secure when I'm not working with them. And I don't need anything fancy because I'm just going to do some color experimentation to start, and then we'll do more painting. So I'm just going to grab a filbert. This is just a connoisseur white Taklon filbert brush, just a small one, to make color notes. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start squeezing paint out onto my palette. Oh, and I guess a paper towel would be handy. So if you're painting along, make sure you have some paper towel or even just a rag if that's the best thing that works for you. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze up my paint. I'm going to start with my white. And if you are still trying to figure out, okay, but I don't know those colors like you do, Angela, like cool your jets. And you want to instead try and figure out which color is going to work best for you. What you can do, that yellow's dried out, so I'm going to grab another one. What you can do instead is play around with your color. Like really just kind of squeeze it out and see which one of the yellows is going to work best for you, or which one of the blues is going to work best. There we go. There's the new one. Out. And then I've got my quinacridone rose here. I like this red a lot because it's more magenta. See, it's almost pinky red, like almost like a pinky magenta color. It doesn't lean purple, like quinacridone magenta itself is very purpley and it's got a lot of blue in it. So it doesn't work for me for color mixing personally. But everybody has their own way of working. Just because I'm telling you this color palette doesn't mean you have to buy these colors. And that's true for every art class. One thing as a beginning painter, I found is every teacher used a different palette, and it was so frustrating for me because suddenly I was buying so many colors. You don't have to do that. You can totally just use what you have and just communicate with your instructor. Is it okay if I change the quinacridone rose for alizarin crimson? I'll say yes every time. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm just going to mix with my brush, although normally I would recommend using a palette knife to do your color mixing. I'm just going to have to make sure I keep my brush really clean in between mixes. So let me try and mix this kind of a color. So I know it's going to be some red and some white, right? Now that's going to give me a pretty clean pink. I'm going to hold it up here so you can see the difference. Very cool. So let's add some yellow to it. Take quite a bit of yellow. Mix those together and now show it. We're getting much closer, but still the cup is a little dirtier looking. So I've got a really clean kind of a peach color going on right now, and I know that that's not right. So how do I dirty up this color? Well, one of the things I can do is I can take some of that brown, let's add some of that brown to it and see where we go. Oh my gosh, look at that, you guys. Like instantly it starts to go towards the right color. That happened quicker than I expected it to happen. This is quite a dull looking color, but I'm going to paint it in here because I think this is the right direction. So effectively, and then I got to make my notes in here as well so I don't forget. This is titanium white plus cadmium yellow light. So I go CYL. My quin rose, so that's QR. And then I used a tiny, tiny bit, tiny burnt umber, BU. So TW, titanium white, plus cadmium millite, plus quin rose, plus tiny BU. And now I've got that in here. I can mix this on the go at any time. I'll remember how my color was made. But I also have some highlighted areas and some shadowed areas. So how do I mix those? I have to play around with that too. How am I going to make a darker version? Now my black mixture again was that blue and brown mixed together. So the minute I mix that blue and brown together, that's going to give me a nice black. I'll paint it in here so you can see. This is just a mixture of that blue and brown, so I'm going to write it down. Ultramarine blue, UB, plus that burnt umber, BU. That's a great color, and if I add some white to it just on its own, well, look at that. I get a nice gray. This is gray with a little bit more blue than brown. Now what happens if I add a little bit more brown to this gray instead? See how now I get this warmer brownish gray? So it gives me power in my grays to mix either warmer, like mousy grays, or I can get the cooler, more bluish grays. Either way, they're still gray, and it's still that power of the ultramarine blue plus burnt umber, but I'm adding titanium white. So I'm just going to say titanium white here. Now I know if I have more blue than brown, so I'm just going to write more ultramarine blue, and this one is more burnt umber than than the blue. So I get the nice option of going really warm or really cool in my grays. That is so powerful for me. So now what if I take some of that color, let me see, some of that brown and some that blue, so that black mixture, and I mix it with some of this nice peachy color that I had. Is it going to work in the, oh, it does work pretty well in the shadows. That's one version of a shadow color for my peach. It's just mixing my black. So I'm just going to write that this is this color plus my black. I'm just going to write here black. And as I make these notes, I get this idea of, okay, now I have power in knowing that I can mix these colors again and again. Sometimes your color might actually be more of a purpley kind of a tone. Maybe instead, I don't know if I'm ever going to get that dark. So I'm going to go a little bit lighter. Add a little bit of my yellow. Red and blue make purple, plus yellow is going to make a little bit of a dull color. I don't know if I see any of this in here, but it might be. Oops, as I paint on my teacup. There might be circumstances where I'd get this kind of a color, like right in this area here, where it's got a little bit more red in it, because it's reflecting the red off of that palette. So this color could be one of the shadow colors too. And this is literally just my original color plus more quin rose and some ultramarine blue. So a purple. So this color plus purple makes this, and that's got a lot of life in it, actually. That's quite a nice shadow color. So you can play around with those and which mixes are going to work best for your shadows. Same with your highlights. I will also play around with how am I going to make my highlights. I know my base color was yellow and red plus white with a little bit of my black, or actually it was just my brown, wasn't it? I apologize. So it's just my red and yellow and brown and white. Get back to my mixture. Yeah, that's pretty close, but I can just get lighter. If I just add white, what's going to happen? Wipe off that brush and add a bunch more white. So what if I just add a bunch of white? That's going to give me a very cool shade. So anywhere I want the color to be cool, I can just add white. But anywhere I want it to be lighter and warmer, I'm going to add some yellow. So looking at these two colors here, this one I think is a really nice one because it's got a lot of that warmth. This is a nice one too because it's lighter. So this is my base plus titanium white. This is my base plus titanium white, and cadmium yellow light. So this and this are both going to come into play. Now, there's one other component that we need to address. Obviously, there's the sage green, but also we want to address the tea itself, where it's going to go from orangey to more yellowy. And this is such a helpful thing for me because if I have this in my mind now, this is how now, as an artist with 20 some odd years experience painting, I can finally sit down and say, okay, I know how to mix the color I need because I've done a lot of this experimentation and it's always in my books. I can go back to it and look at it anytime. So for my tea, I know it's going to be kind of a reddish brown tone. So I'm going to start with red and brown and mix those two together. So this is just going to be that red and brown mixed together. If I add some yellow to it, now I'm going to get a little bit more orangey because I'm thinking of this mixture here. So I'm going to write this down before I forget. Quin rose plus burnt umber, and this is that plus cadmium yellow light. What if I add more cadmium yellow light to that color? Ooh, that's going to be nice. It's going to give me a nice warm orange color. So again, that's just this color plus more cadmium yellow light. And then in places, maybe I want it to be a little bit cooler. I can just add more white to it and maybe a little bit more brown. There are places in tea, oops, there's a lot of red on that. There are places in tea where it touches, especially if the inside of the cup is white, like this one is, where when the tea layers up against the white cup, it looks really cool-ish. And I think, this is a little too pinky for me. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to it. It's very similar to this color too, which I don't mind actually. So this is with adding titanium white, and this is adding titanium white plus cadmium yellow light. And if I don't write it down as I go along, I'll forget. So that's why I continually make these notes. Let's look at sage real quick too, and then we'll get to painting. To make green, I'm going to use a little bit of blue, a bunch of yellow, and right away I'm going to get a very happy spring green color. So to make it a little bit lighter and maybe a little bit cooler, I'm just going to add white. So if I just add white, I'm going to get a very minty color. If I add white plus yellow, I'm going to get a very happy yellow green. So adding that yellow is very powerful. So this is just the ultramarine blue plus cadmium yellow light, and then add titanium white plus cadmium yellow light. The cadmium yellow light helps keep colors warmer, but if I want to go grayish, one of the things I can do is I could try adding some red. Red and green are complementary colors, so I could play with that. But I'm going to take this green, I'm going to add some brown to it, and then some white, and see what that does. That's going to give me a very grayish kind of a green that's a little bit more of an army green color. Leans towards an army green-ish. Actually, that's kind of nice right there. I kind of like that. I know it's kind of dull, but I think that would look really good next to my cup. I kind of like that. Ooh, I'm excited. Okay, so I'm going to write that down. That's going to be the base color. So we're going to talk about that base color plus burnt umber. Okay, I think I like that. I think that's going to work really nicely for me with the grays, the grayed down greens, and then I've got these nice warm peaches and the really hot warm tea. And what I like about having that tea be so vibrant is that that's really where your eye will go first, and then it will go to everything else. All right, before I move on to actually starting a little demo painting of this just kind of sketch, but I'm not going to do this painting actually. I'm just going to follow along with one of my existing paintings because this one I really want to save for acrylic live. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how I go through color mixing. But before I go on with that, do you guys have any questions about the color mixing or choosing of the palette?
Well, I have a question because I am not 20 years into this. When you
Yes.
first started this, was it just a bunch of experimentation and like this doesn't work, that doesn't work? And I mean, I assume it takes longer than about 15 minutes, which it takes you now.
Yes, a lot longer. Oh
Okay.
my
Yeah.
gosh. I
Okay.
took years and years of color mixing classes with my grandmother. I'd go up and stay with her for a whole week and we'd take a class together on color mixing. And what I find now, it's interesting. I've tried to do a couple of different color theory classes and they're just not popular because it's not sexy to just
Oh,
do this kind
yeah.
of thing. But it is so valuable because those skills that you learn now, that color theory background is really helping me on the palette. I'm spending so much less time trying to mix the right color. And
Okay.
instead I'm theorizing. And I've got, you know what, I might share with you guys real quick. Hang on a quick second. I've created something which may or may not be a good idea to share. I'm going to share it with you because I'm sure there are going to be people out there who are either going to love it or hate it. So take it with a grain of salt, my friends. Okay, hang on here. It's like everything else, right? So let me
Yeah.
see. I'm going to look at my resources. I've got these aids that I've created, and I'm hoping I can find them. Oh yes, handouts. Here we go. It's all about color, and I kind of tend to think. I try to think logically about things. So I apologize for the almost mathematical way that I'm looking at this. Okay,
That's
so
all right. I have a math profession, so
oh, well
yes,
then,
it'll
hopefully
be
this
great.
works for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, there's a color wheel. My favorite color wheel is the Quiller color wheel.
Okay.
Stephen Quiller is a watercolorist, but he makes a fantastic color wheel, which is more practical than just looking at, red, blue, green. It actually
Mhm.
plots tubes of paint. So this is mine. This is cadmium yellow light. For me is my nice cool yellow. Ultramarine blue falls here. Cerulean blue is closer to yellow. So you'll see kind of as you go around, this gets closer to yellow. These colors get closer to red. So
Oh,
dioxazine
great. Yeah.
purple, you know how it goes around. And then it shows like two where neutrals would be in the middle. So more vibrant color actually should be farther away from the center and the more dull color should be closer to the middle. And that's why I placed burnt umber in here. Burnt umber is effectively a dark orangey reddish color. And transparent red iron oxide would be closer to red down in here somewhere. A little bit more vibrant, but it'd be right around here.
Mm.
So the Quiller color wheel, I totally highly recommend looking into this for yourselves because it really can help you see where your tubes of paint fall on a color wheel as opposed to guessing. So that was something that was really helpful. But then I also created these color charts. So this is a value color chart, value flow chart, I should say, pardon me. So I'm totally happy to share these with you guys. If you find these interesting at all, they're really boring, I think, but this is how I think when I'm color mixing. I'm thinking, okay, let's say I'm starting with a red, and then I think, okay, do I need to make that red darker? Yes. Does it need to be darker and warmer? Yes, then do this. Does it need to
Mhm.
be darker and cooler? Yes, then do this. And it's got a bunch of tips on how you can darken the color and make it a little cooler. And these boxes show you if I have this color here, but I want it darker and warmer, this is actually a darker, warmer version of that. It's kind of like a brick red,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
but a darker and cooler version of that color might be lean more towards purple. What if I want to make that same color lighter? Okay, it's going to turn to pink because it's red. Does it
Hmm.
want to be lighter and cooler? So just thinking about like what I just did there with the peaches, the lighter and cooler has some blue and white in it. The lighter and warmer is going to be more peachy. So it tells you how you can make it lighter and cooler or lighter and warmer. So I'm doing
Oh,
this
yeah.
math in my head and I'm getting faster at it than I was, but I'm still finding things that shock me all the time and different color mixes that I never thought would be made by mixing certain colors together. So for me, having this flow chart, this
Hmm.
is a color value flow chart, but I also have a flow chart for color saturation. So for example, a tube of color that you get is never going to be more vibrant than it comes in that tube. Never. You can't make it more vibrant, but you can make it. So yeah, so I said yes. If you want to make it more vibrant, no can do.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're toast. But you can make it less vibrant. No matter what you do, when you start mixing color, you're not going to make it more vibrant. You're always dulling it down.
Mm.
And for me, that makes it so important to use as few colors as possible. If you have 20 colors on your palette and you start mixing them all together, you're going to get really dull, lifeless color quickly. And so that's why I like to think about the five colors. If I
Hmm.
can choose five main colors, it's going to make my color mixing more powerful and more predictable. So if I need to make a hue less vibrant, and I've shown it here gray, if it's going to be grayer than it is, or less vibrant, less saturated, less chroma. The words chroma, saturation, and vibrancy are all talking about the same thing, whether a color is really vibrant and brilliant or kind of grayish and dull. And so if you want to make the color less vibrant, the easiest way to do that is you can just add white or black, and that's going to kill color immediately. But there's other ways to do it as well. So I've got all these little, do you want to make it less vibrant? Yes. Does it need to be duller and the same value? Then try these things. Does it need to be duller and darker? Try this.
Mm.
And so on and so forth. And then I've got one other, I think, another flow chart, color temperature. That gets tricky too. Thinking about how warm or cool. So I'll send all three of these to you guys if you're interested
Oh,
in.
that would be amazing. I would love to have this. This is how my brain thinks in a
Oh,
grid or a flow chart. So,
I'm so
yes.
happy to hear
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's great.
That's very cool. Thank you.
It just kind of and you if you find errors in it, please feel free to email me and tell me because I'll update it and make sure it's correct. These are from I created these back in 2020 because it just I felt like it was a more logical mindset
Yeah.
approach to color mixing and really I mean knowing being able to mix different values of a color so powerful. And that's
Hmm.
90% of the issues I see in a painting is people struggle with mixing different values. Then you've got to think about the saturation and you've got to think about the temperature. There's so many things to think about. Your brain starts to hurt. I would
Hmm.
go to these classes and come home and nap for hours because I was so mentally exhausted. So I'm hoping this helps a little bit, but it just tells you like if you have a starting hue, whatever color it might be, do you need to warm it up? You know, if I'm
Hmm.
like that pink, if
Yeah.
I just used white, that didn't warm it up. That actually kind of cooled it down.
Hmm.
So the minute I added white and yellow, it warms it up. But then I also needed to dull it down. Remember, we're going to go back
Hmm.
to the color saturation flow chart. I needed it to be a little duller than it was. So I added some brown or some black,
Hmm.
my mix of black. And color temperature is a whole can of
Oh,
beans.
that's true. Yeah.
I mean, you can look at a palette and say, okay, there's certain colors that are cooler in color temperature and there's certain colors that lean warmer, and you can play around with which one you think is best. And there's no standard in the industry, like the art world industry. There's no standard on this. So you're not going to be wrong if you look at
Mm.
cerulean blue and you think it's cooler than ultramarine blue. That's not wrong. That's the way you see it. It's your
Hmm.
biology, your chemistry, the way physics is treating your body, and the way that your eyes are perceiving the color that's coming in and how it affects you. So there's no right or wrong when it comes to color temperature, but you have to understand it. I think if you want to move past the basics of color mixing, knowing color temperature can make you that much more powerful. And the way I boil it down to the most basic concept is if you see things as being yellow, more yellowy, are being warmer, then colors that start to lean towards yellows are going to be warmer for you.
Hmm.
That's me. I see
Hmm.
yellow as being one of the warmest colors. Some people see red as the warmest color, and so that's where the blues can really shift. But for me, it's
Oh.
yellow. Yellow feels like the warmest color. Anytime I add yellow to my color mixes, it warms it up. Whereas when I add red, it doesn't always warm up my color mixes. So
Hmm.
for me, it's yellow. So for example, if I have an ultramarine blue and then I go back to looking at that Quiller color wheel, I'm going to go back to that Quiller color wheel here. Oops, I'm going to get the bigger one. This Quiller color wheel, if I have ultramarine blue on this palette, for me, it's farther away from yellow than cerulean blue. Cerulean blue, this is a shorter path than
Hmm.
ultramarine blue. So for me, cerulean blue is warmer. So if I'm painting a picture of a tropical scene with a really warm day and a really warm sky, I'm going to use cerulean blue as my sky color. Whereas if
Okay.
I'm painting a scene from Alaska and it's really cold out that day and the snow is really warm colored, it's got a lot of cerulean blue, but the sky is really cold and cool, I'm going to use ultramarine blue in my
Mm.
sky. I know
Oh,
that
that's great.
I
That's
hope that helps.
terrific. That was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Complete
Yeah.
sense. Love that.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Okay, so real quick, since you guys are my only people in here today, you get to pick. which one of these paintings
Oh,
should I just kind of mess with a little bit. I mean, it's kind of 50-50. It's between the two of you guys and me. So, I mean,
oh, can we do I mean, I don't know, Carol, what you think. I would love to try some teacup, like a simple one.
Sure, that works for me.
a simple one, so nothing too crazy. Like there's a lot of pattern in a lot of these. So let me look at something a little more simplistic. I mean, that's a little more simplistic, but I want to think about something
Yeah,
that,
that one's pretty.
does this one work?
Yeah, it'd be nice to have a little bit of flowers and stuff in it, but not. I have to say, when I saw your ones with the intricate patterns, like
Yeah.
that's not right now.
This again,
That looks really hard personally. Is it?
it was, and
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
tell
that
you.
looks
I
really
mean,
hard.
just talking about this one before we go on to that one. I mean,
Yeah,
this is a fun play in trying to figure out which colors to mix because I wanted it to look red, but it has to be
yeah.
under tea.
Yes.
So, I mean, there's some other ones too that are kind of like that where I really struggled to figure out how to do the
Oh,
pattern.
yeah.
It wasn't as, I mean, and this one was tough because the blue ended right at my T line. That's a tangent, by the way. A tangent is when things touch, and I don't think
Oh,
I should not have done that. I should have made the T
oh,
line a little lower so that it went from blue to white, or have the T overlap the blue.
oh, interesting. Okay. Huh.
But yeah, anytime. Oh, here's another one. The greens. See how the green
Yeah.
above the T line is really kind of a bluish green, like a happy green, like all this green. But underneath, it's really just kind of a dark, like olive green, because the T colors are
Oh,
impacted. So you could just take your oranges and mix it in with your green to get you
okay.
a color that's right. So yeah, that's really, it's difficult painting elements inside the T and getting it to be soft edged, going from
Yes.
dark to light. It is complicated. So
Every
let's,
time I go in that art gallery and I see those paintings of yours, I think, wow, that's like, it's amazing.
you know what? You have just made my day. Thank you
Oh,
so much. So
yeah.
I'm going to take this teacup here
Okay.
and real quick, I'm going to leave it on the screen for half a second so I can just sketch it in my book here real quick. And then I'm going to talk
Okay.
about this sketch. So I'm just going to start by
Okay. I
sketching it.
need to go get the can like a small canvas and something. So
Okay,
I
go
need
on,
like
go
two
grab it.
minutes. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to put in all the extra stuff. I'm just going to do the teacup so that we can talk about that. All the other stuff I'm not going to worry about too much.
Perfect.
Okay, so we'll just focus ourselves on the tea. And I'm just going to do a quick little, I just did a quick little sketch, and I'm going to take a quick screenshot for myself. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my iPad again. All right. And I'll just wait a moment until Lynn is back.
So I'm presuming that you're doing the tea not by just glazing or some cheaty way. You're actually mixing.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Carol, because this is so important for me. I do not do any glazing.
Ah, I knew it.
Yeah, no, I don't do any glazing. I try and mix local color that I see in the place that I see it. So that's a great question. And I do have to say there was this one time I went to a juried show that I had one of those teacups in. And it's always fun to kind of like go to a show where your work is in, nobody knows who you are. Because nobody knows who I am. So I'm just like hanging out, and I was looking at all the art. I wasn't there to spy on people. I was not. But, some people are loud. And I am a loud person myself too. So there was this dude, and he was talking about my teacup, and he was clearly talking to a group of, I don't know if they were students or family members or something, but he was very knowledgeable. He knew how I did this painting, and he was telling them, this is masterful glazing work. This is how she does it. And this is how it goes along. And I'm thinking to myself, no, that's wrong. Oh, no, no, those aren't the colors I used. Oh,
That's
no, that's not
funny.
how I did it. I mean, I was hopping inside to just kind of say, no, it's all wrong. But
Oh
of course, I would
gosh.
never do that. But it always got,
That's so funny. Like, yeah, I think it's funny too because you wonder, do these people know? Because they're guessing like what you were doing, right? And
yeah, all of us are guessing if
yeah,
we're looking at somebody else's work.
yeah,
I mean, nobody can know for sure. I mean, you can take your best educated guess. And a lot of masters used to use glazing. It's a very old technique. I have nothing against it, and I've used it before, but never for that purpose. The only time I ever use glazing is if maybe a painting is too cool in an area. I
Mm,
might glaze over it with some Indian yellow and some glazing medium to make it warmer. That's the only time I'll use glazing for the most part. Otherwise, I like the challenge of mixing the color as I go. I
mm,
mean, it's really it feeds something inside of me, first of all, to create something from nothing. I mean, the fact that I have this blank canvas and I'm going to try and make something that looks like what I'm painting is a great fun challenge for me. And then the next challenge is, can I mix the colors that I need as I need them? And that's an ongoing process. I mean, I've been
mm.
painting over 20 years and I still don't feel like I've touched the tip of the iceberg on color theory. It's so complex and it takes a long time to really, figure it out. So it's a journey. All of painting is a journey. All right, let me go back to my iPad here. Okay, here it comes. Okay, my peeps. So I've just done, I'm going to put this out of the way here. I'm going to move this for a second so I don't drag my arm through it. Um, I've just got my sketchbook, and what I'll start by doing is just creating some ovals. Now, I'm going to switch to my 7B, but I would normally sketch very lightly. Can you see how lightly that's sketched?
Mm-hmm.
And on anything, I'll typically sketch lightly, not super hard, not super. I don't want to. If I'm working on paper, I don't want to groove the paper, right? If I'm working on a canvas, I don't want to put a bunch of black marks on the canvas that could become part of my painting. So what I'm doing instead is I'm going to use a soft pencil, a 7B, so I get a nice hard mark that you'll see, a soft mark that you'll see, pardon me, but I don't want to groove the paper. And what I've done is I've just put together the basics of that teacup. It was kind of we're looking at a 3/4 view of it from the side, and there's a shadow being cast. So obviously the light source was over here somewhere. Okay, so one of the things I want to impart to you is how to draw objects like teacups or glasses or anything of such that has a lot of ovals in it. Ovals can be really tricky. And as you saw from that first beer glass that I showed you, it's easy to go astray with ovals. So the first thing I always tell people, and you know what, maybe I'll use a blue pencil for my the marks that I'm going to tell you about that you're not going to draw necessarily, but I want you to think about. The first thing is you want to have your center point, right? So you want to make sure that you know where the center point is so that those ovals in the cup are all lined up. Because if they're not lined up, it's going to look really strange. So for example, if I was to take a teacup and do this, like if my bottom and top ovals were slightly off, see how now the teacup is kind of skewed? So I've got to be careful to line things up well. Next, the next thing I need to think about is how tall the oval is. So the bottom and the top of it versus how wide it is. Oh, my pencil just broke. So I've got to make sure it's balanced, centered within that center line, but I also think about how wide versus how tall it is, because that can make an impact as well, depending on how, whether the cup is like straight looking down on it, that's almost a perfect oval. But as I move the cup, notice how now the oval is a little less round. I move it this way, it's becoming more and more of an ellipse until we go sideways, and then there's no ellipse at all. It's a straight line. So the oval and the shape of that oval, I'm talking about the top of this cup here, this is really going to dictate what the angle is that you're looking at the cup on. So for me, I figured it out as to being like a bounding box. So if I know it's going to be a wide one, I'm going to start with just some lines. So I'm making these dark, but I literally am just going to go in with some angles and make sure the angles are all roughly the same all the way around. And then I can go in and connect them if I want to. But I just want to make sure that it's kind of equal. That wasn't quite equal. This needed to be a little bit higher. And I just do that kind of work to figure out my ovals and then do the same thing below. I know I'm going to have an oval that's going to kind of come up this way. Let me see, my cup kind of, I always find that the cup itself, this oval on top is a little wider than where the cup meets because there's a thickness of the china. So I always find that oval on top is usually a little bigger than the area below it. So again, I just have to be fairly equal on either side of the half of this line that I put through. And I also have to think about the height of this. I'm looking at my teacup now and I'm like realizing, oh, I made this way too tall. It actually is more like that. So I'm gonna erase what I just did. And instead, it's a very shallow teacup, this one that I was using. So probably more something like this. Now this half here is not quite right. It's got to be a little bit, and this is what I do. I just go back and forth and I compare and make sure that they are kind of equal-ish.
So do you usually sketch on the canvas with pencil, or what do you do as you're doing this?
Yeah, typically I
Oh,
don't
okay.
use pencil on my canvas. Typically, let me see if I got some here. I'll either use a water-soluble pencil. This is one here. Because then you don't have to erase, and
Oh,
canvas is hard to erase on, right?
yeah,
So I'm doing this on paper right now with pencil,
right.
but I'll either use water-soluble pencil or,
Okay.
and I don't know if I have any here in my studio right now. It doesn't look like it. Or I use a chalk pastel pencil because they can
Oh,
easily be washed off as well. So you can just use water
oh,
to get rid of
okay.
it. Yeah, and it keeps the canvas more clean that way.
Okay.
So this is, like I said, graphite water. It's graphite, what is it called? Graphite Aquarelle by Faber-Castell.
Okay.
Faber-Castell.
Okay.
And so it can just be washed away. But I'm using just regular graphite so you can see it
Mm.
right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, using something that's like easily washed away is super helpful.
Okay, because I usually just do the sketching in like a very watery color, but then sometimes
Yeah.
it shows up underneath and then
Yeah, you
it's a
can do
little,
that too. That can
yeah.
totally work. Yeah, you just have to cover it. Or you can let it show through too. That's not terrible. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's not that bad. And then I go,
Even the masters you saw though, like they did something and
let them
fixed it.
see some of your work, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why not? I know I'm going to have the handle in here. Somewhere's a very tiny little handle. And then I
Hmm.
have to do the same thing with the oval of the saucer. I'm going to have to create kind of like a bounding box. How wide is it versus how tall is it? And then I just do the same sort of thing. And I do it all the way around, even through the teacup. Because if I don't do it through my teacup, what can happen is I will get an odd oval. I've just found over the years, for me, with the way my brain works, I have to go right through my teacup and then just obscure. So something along these lines is what I'm seeing. And I'm going to go back now that I've kind of got that sketch and share my screen with you to see again the actual painting. So this is the teacup, and I've just kind of cut some of it. Can you see this cutout part?
Hmm. Yeah.
That's all I'm really focusing on, so I'll get
Okay.
rid of the
Yeah.
rest of this. So I'm just focusing on this teacup here and not the background. And you can see how it's a really shallow teacup. It's got a little bit of tea in there, and then it's got a little bit of a scallop along this bottom edge, not much, and a little bit of pattern. So this is what I'm going to focus on for this little demo. Okay, let's go back.
Oh, I have another question. Do you
Yeah.
paint exclusively in acrylics or do you change mediums or what do you do?
That's a great question. Acrylic is by far my very favorite medium. I
Oh,
use
okay.
it 75% of the time, if not 80% of the time. But there are times where I'll use oil. And then a lot of time when I use gouache. So the bulk of the
Oh,
time
okay.
probably is going to be gouache and acrylic. And gouache is mostly what I'll take on the road with me when I travel. So this painting behind me right now is one
Yeah.
that I did from a photograph I took in Paris on the
Oh.
Ile de Vie. And I can take my sketchbook out at the table and I have a little, like literally a box this big of my gouache paints, and I use the lid as a palette, and I use the tubes. I
Mm.
squeeze the tubes out onto the lid and just sketch paint so I can get color.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Amazing.
use you oil sometimes because I have so much oil paint that I got inherited from my grandmother. So sometimes I feel like I want to use it, but I don't love oil. I mean, oil is beautiful and it can create a translucency, but it's so slow. And I
Mm,
like
hmm.
working a little quicker than that.
Oh, okay. That's
So,
great.
yeah. All right, let's go back to my iPad. And I don't have a picture of this. And I'm so sorry, you guys. I don't have a picture of this painting that I can put on the screen. You know what I can do though, before I start doing this demo is I'm going to share this screenshot with you. So you guys, if you want to, I'm going to go into the chat feature here. Okay, here's my screenshot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to you in the chat. So I'm going to pop out my chat and I'm just going to attach it real quick.
Oh, thank you. That's great.
Of course. Let me see from my computer. There we go. I just sent it to you both. So hopefully you can see that in the chat.
Oh, yep, it just came. Oh, perfect. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So now I'm just going to go back. So you'll at least have that. You'll see that's what I'm looking
Okay.
at on my screen. And that's what I'm going to paint from is a painting, that painting. Okay. Now I'm also in my drawing going to put in usually, and I'm not going to do anything around it, but I'm just going to put in some of the shadow. I've got a shadow down here. I'm just going to rough that in. I've got to put my foot in of this teacup down here. Oops. I'm going to use my darker pencil-ish. And I've got some shadow coming up and around this way. And I'm also seeing some shadow underneath. So this light source is really quite straight on. It looks like it's probably down here because this shadow is being cast away from it. And I've got tea inside. Something like this. And then we'll forget about all the rest of the stuff. We'll just look at the teacup. All right, so I'm going to use this as my base for painting. I've got my palette right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new pad of paper. So I have a cleaner set of color mixes because I've already got all this. And one thing with acrylic, you've probably all found this, is that it is basically liquid plastic. So what happens is when it dries, it will peel off and cause all kinds of problems. Let me see if I can find my palette knife.
Are you just gonna use the same colors?
I am. I'm going to
Okay,
use the
that's
exact
great.
same colors. You
Oh, so
got it.
is this your basic, like you often use the use five?
Almost always. I call this
Okay.
my desert island palette. I can't
Okay,
find
it's
it.
cool.
I always use these colors, almost always. I can use these colors for almost anything. The only things that I find that I can't use these colors for exclusively are portraits.
Okay, yeah, because
So,
of the skin tones.
yeah, with the skin tones, I usually have a viridian hue in here. I use this same palette, but I also, instead of that yellow, I'll use a yellow ochre instead of my cadmium yellow light. And then I'll add a green. So instead
Okay.
of 5 colors, I'll have 6 for my
Yeah, this is very impressive. That's great.
palette. And it's so nice to use a very limited palette because, like I said before, I'm gonna go wrong a lot less. I'm still gonna go wrong. There's no perfection in any of this, but I'm gonna go wrong a lot less if I have really reliable color colors that I can use to mix from. So at
So,
least that's what I find.
so
Okay.
on a canvas, would you normally tone your canvas, or do you like prefer to start from white?
That's a good question. It really depends on my mood and the subject matter. So, if I have a background that has a lot of color in it, I might start with a colored background. Like if I know that there's a lot of blue, I might start with an orangey yellow background so that color shows through. But a lot of times on my teacups, I want those tea colors to be really pure. So I'll keep that background white. All right, I'm going to start with a couple of filbert brushes here. I've got these are both synthetic white bristles, and I've got one number 4, and this is fairly small. So I'm working fairly small here. This number 4 is a little bit smaller than the width of the top of this teacup. And then I've got a smaller one. This is a number 2, which is about half of the size of the top of that teacup. I always look at, the size of your brush really is dependent on the size of the subject matter of the canvas. And then I'm just going to grab a little round brush. So I'm just going to use these 3 brushes. Okay. So remember, I've done a lot of practice with color mixing, so I'm going to mix on the fly pretty quickly, but I'm going to tell you what colors I'm mixing and why I'm mixing them as I go along, okay? So I'm going to start by not worrying too much about pattern. I'm just going to start by laying down color and then add pattern to it. And for me, my focal point is going to be the T. So I'm going to start there. I know it's a brownish red, just like in that other one I was telling you about. So I'm going to start with some red and I'm going to mix in some brown. I really miss my palette knife here. And then I'm just going to go in and I'm going to start with the darkest value. And my color is a little dry, so I'm just going to paint it in. I'm working on paper, and just so you know, paper absorbs a lot more paint than canvas. So typically, what I'll do on a canvas, I won't use any water mixed in with my paint. I'm only using water here because I'm working on paper. But I like to use pure paint and no water as much as possible. Because the minute you add water, you're going to just make your color more translucent. And that's not really what I want. Although with paper, it's a little bit different. I can get away with it a little bit more. So I'm taking my red and brown mixture and now I'm going to add some white and some yellow to that to start to get a little bit more orangey and a little lighter in my value. And now I'm just going to start going over top of that darker reddish color and moving up. And more clean orangey color with no brown mixed in as I go along. Because tea tends to be kind of brownish and reddish down in the darkest area, and then it can tend to get much more yellowy and a little bit lighter as it moves upward. Now, my pencil lines are going to mix in here and make the color a little bit dirty. That's okay. I'll go right back over it here a little bit later with thicker color. And I'm going to go a little bit outside of the line that I had created. And I'm going to move my arm around the direction that I want that T to go in. So if I need to shift my brush to use one side or the other of the brush, whether it's thick or thin, in this case I'm using the thin side of this number 4 filbert, so I get a smaller mark to create that part of the T where it gets lighter up above. And I've gone really messy, and that's okay because I'm going to put all the whites in a little bit later here too. Next, I'm going to start with some shadows. I might as well start with the darkest shadow. So remember, I'm using black mixed of brown and blue together. I'm going to put a little bit of white in it so it's not super, super dark. And I need to add a little bit of water because I'm working on paper. And I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to throw it in, nice and messy. And I'm creating these really jaggedy edges on purpose here because eventually with the table, I would go over it and then make it smoother. And I don't want it to be a really hard edge. If I did this, this is a hard edge where it's a perfect transition between the white and the gray. If I make a soft edge, I'm going to rub the brush and kind of make it look blurry. And what that's going to do is it's going to help me have a better transition between the tabletop and the gray that I'm using for this shadow. So visually, it will look more blended and more smooth, but also tactily, meaning there won't be a hard edge of paint that is a little like ledge. Have you ever had that happen when you paint? Sometimes when you paint a thick gob of paint on something, it can actually create like a little like bump physically. So by going around and kind of rubbing the edges, this is creating, now my brush is dry. This alone is helping me create a soft edge. And shadows have soft edges anyway, so that doesn't bother me. Give me a little bit more of this color right underneath. Now, I'm going to get lighter as I get farther away from that shadow. So I'm going to add some white to that. I'm going to pretend we're on a white tabletop instead of that wooden tabletop that the original painting had. Now, if I get lighter, I'm going to dry brush over it, and I'm going to kind of use the brush like a plane landing and taking off the runway. So I'm flicking it in the direction of the shadow. And see how messy it looks? It's kind of like a little bit of a messy kind of hazy look, which a lot of people don't like that look, but I love it because it's going to give me that soft, this is a scrumble now, that soft texture of the shadow getting lighter from the darker areas. I'm just going to rub it in. and lighten it up a little bit. And if it's not perfect, that's okay. It's a painting, not a photograph. I'm going to get a little bit lighter yet and just do a little bit more on the very farthest edges of that shadow. So the shadow appears to get lighter as it goes farther away. All right, I'm going to move to my smaller brush now. And I'm going to do a similar thing here in these shadows. But what I've done, if you look at the photo that I sent you, that screenshot, you can see there's some blue around the edges. So I've gone a little bit more bluish than brownish for the shadows on the teacup itself. So I'm going to add my blue and brown together with a little bit of white, but this time I'm adding more blue than brown. And I'm just going to go in, and again, I'm just going to go to my teacup. I'm going to paint in the shadows bigger than they need to be, overlapping some of my drawing if need be, and put in some of these shadows. The big ones that I see here that kind of outline the teacup against the saucer, because again, I'm kind of getting a light source that's above and straight on. So it's kind of coming, where it's giving a little bit of a shadow underneath the teacup, but it's also shadowing behind the teacup. So it's a really unusual light source that I've got here. And that back half of that saucer. I'm going to worry about the teacup itself in a bit. Same with inside the teacup. I'm going to do that in a minute. But right now I'm going to start by lightening up this color a little bit. Maybe I'll lighten it and add a little bit more blue and go to the side of my shadows. And again, following the direction of that shadow, I'm going to soften it, especially where it gets farther away from the teacup. And I'm just literally rubbing my brush with no water on it really at all. So it's nice dry brush, making a messy mark that's bigger than it needs to be. I'm going all the way out into where I'm going to eventually paint over with my saucer, my teacup saucer's colors. And if I need to go darker in some places, like right underneath the teacup, I might have some really nice dark scallops. So I'm just going to paint some dots that might indicate those scallops and then soften them up with my gray. So that right underneath the teacup, it's got that nice dark. And again, if I overlap my drawing a little bit in places, that's okay, because I want to go bigger with these darks, because the lights are going to sit on top. Look at how messy this mark is right around this edge. That's all right, because that's also going to get covered up. So the key is just kind of going in and seeing what you see, trying to paint what you see, and don't stress out too much about it. I can always go back in, like with my tea, now that this is all dry and I had those, this is where that pencil can cause problems, because the pencil, the graphite, mixes with the paint color. So I'm going to go back in now with a cleaner orange. It was my yellow and white with a little bit of the red mixed in, especially up here in the top. I'm just going to dry brush some of that cleaner orange color right along that top edge where it's really catching the light. The rest of it is in shadow from the front of the teacup. And again, I've gone too big, but that's okay. All right, I also see a little bit of shadowing down here that's quite a bit lighter, and I've got it a little bit warmer. So I'm adding a little bit more of the blue, or sorry, pardon me, a little bit more of the brown to my gray mixture. So blue and brown, but I'm adding a little bit more brown than blue and a lot of white. So I want it just to be a little bit lighter. And it's just going to go right here in the front. That's where I see it. And now what I need to do is I need to get an oval that's going this direction. I can either move my arm awkwardly like this to get it, or I can actually turn my canvas. Because my hand is, see how it's kind of like a windshield wiper? See the natural movement on my hand creates this rounded motion? I can use that to my benefit. So I'm just going to go right near the edge and start to put in that rounded edge, cleaning up a little bit of that edge of the saucer. And I'm going to stand up here so I can see it properly. maybe now I'm using a little bit more of a hard edge. There, that looks pretty good. Come back over. And that helped me create that edge. I don't need it to be a perfect hard edge. It can be a little bit soft, but I'm just going to go in and smooth it out a little bit now that I've got it in there. Again, it can still be soft. Doesn't have to be super hard, but it's harder than it was. And I know I'm going to put some golds and some highlights in here, but I'm just going to go back over it a little bit to make it a little bit more opaque. Okay, now I've got some highlights or some shadows that I need to do in the cup and on the front of the cup. And again, I had some more blues on the shadows here. I'm going to use more browns. And the reason I'm using the different shades of grays is partially to help separate them, but also just because of the way that light is bouncing. I'm seeing it as being cooler back there behind the light, and the reflected shadow instead is going to be a little warmer because it's kind of reflecting the white here. Whereas in the back, it was just a bunch of greenery and stuff, so it looked a little bit more bluish. That's pretty subtle and pretty nitpicky of me to see that. Don't stress about that. But you know, over time, as you start to recognize color temperature, you'll start to see it more clearly. It takes a while to train yourself to see it. I'm just going to go down here in the bottom and get some shadow right underneath with this warmer color, kind of blending it into the other grays. So I got a little bit more shadow down there. And the one thing I don't like about mixing with my brush is I don't get big enough mixtures. So I'm regretting leaving my palette knife downstairs in my studio. Okay, so I'm going to mix more of my warmish gray, which has more brown in it than blue. And I know that my darkest gray in the front of the cup is right here. And it kind of comes down. And then there's reflected light below. And then there's a little bit of this gray right underneath the lip here of the cup. So I'm going to go in, and again, I'm going to turn my arm as needed to help me get the shape right. And then I'm going to start lightening up this gray. And this is a hard edge going from one tone to the other. I'm going to wipe off my brush, and using the shape of the shadow, I'm going to go around and just kind of soften up that edge. It's okay if I have a gap here because the cup has a thickness to it and it's going to be lighter along the edge. It's going to catch the light. I'm just going to add the lighter part of the shadow here. Most things that are 3D, especially rounded objects, the shadow is just inside. It's not along the right, it's not right along the edge. So you'll see it's a little bit lighter than both the background and the darkest part of the shadow right here on the edge of the cup and going under the cup too. So I'm just going to put that in. And again, if I need to like darken it up a smidge and have it really nicely blend in, I'm just going to dry brush along it to kind of keep it a little bit softer where it connects with the lighter batches that I'm going to mix. And I can just keep going along again, thinking about that dry brush technique, not worrying about pattern yet, just trying to get it all in nice and simplistically. And depending on the size of the pattern, if there was a large pattern like flowers, I would paint those in advance. But this way, I can just come in and start to create these nice, soft, smooth transitions. So I'm going to add some more white and just continue getting lighter. Again, just plopping it in to start, then wiping off my brush really well, and then just kind of dry brushing to soften up the edge where the shadow shows up. And everything is shades of gray to start. I'm going to get rid of the white of the canvas, and everything is going to be shades of gray. There's not going to be any white yet. I saved that for the very end, and usually it's very rare that I put in pure white. And I'm just going to make sure I dry brush over all of this, keeping it nice and soft, so I get a bit of a soft transition. And if I felt like it wasn't soft enough in places, I can go back in and just kind of soften it a little bit more. It's almost like carving in a way. Now, for the inside of the cup, I've got shadow in there too. I've got some, some lighter values in here and some really light values here, but there's some shadow, especially on these sides. And what I tend to find is the oranges of the tea here are going to bounce up into this. So these are for sure going to be light, warm shadows. So I'm going to use my brown with a little bit of blue, and I'm going to mix in a tiny, tiny bit of my orange into that color. So my shadow color here is going to be a little warmer typically. So I'm just going to kind of go in. I'm not going to touch the tea necessarily, maybe just graze it. And taking this mixture of warm gray with a little bit of tiny, tiny, tiny bit of orange mixed in, I'm going to put in my shadows in those corners, those corner edges. Nice and messy. Now, the handle itself, I'll do that at the very end. I'm not going to worry about that. And we can even skip it. We don't even need to worry about it too much. I just want to get now all of the color in here so I can put some pattern. And we can talk about pattern. So I'm going to obscure the white. I'm not going to leave any white. White is the very last thing that I'm going to do. So instead, what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to take my bigger brush, clean it off, and I'm going to mix some more of my white and my black, which is my brown and blue mixture. So I get a very, very light gray. And I'm just going to start obscuring my whites of the canvas. And I can put this in really messy if I want to, just to get rid of that color. The white background, I should say, not color. And then when I start to get close to the shadows that I've already created, now is when I have to get a little bit more mindful. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to put my pinky on the canvas if I need to go around and dry brush in the same shape as the shadow, a soft edge. Going right over the shadow because the shadow is big. If I go over the shadow, I'm still going to see the shadow. I'm not going to obscure it, but I'm just getting rid of the worst of it. And we're going to get quite a bit lighter by the time we're done. But for now, at least, I can stair step it from my darkest values to this mid-tone value that I'm creating. I'm using this mid-tone value for my lightest value right now. And eventually I'll get lighter. So again, just going to go next to my shadow. Just dry brush in the shape of that shadow. Overlapping some of my shadow areas. But I'm getting this nice stair step. If I just went to white, what would happen instead, like if I go from, let's say, like a dark blue to just a white, it can be really hard to step those colors together. It's just too disparate. There's too much contrast. It'd always be better instead to go to a mid-tone blue first and bridge that gap to go between them and make a soft edge. So making a soft edge, I'm using dry brushing, but I'm also not going from a black to a white. I'm going from a black to a gray to a light gray, and then eventually to a white. Now I'm going to do the cup again as well. Oops, I need more brown. This is my plein air palette that I'm working with. These tubes are from my plein air bag, and they're a little drier than the tubes in my studio because typically when you're painting outside, it's warmer, more arid. At least that's what I find. My paints that I use in my outdoor bag dry up quicker than the paints I have in my studio. Okay, so I'm just going to mix a lighter version of this warmish gray. So again, I can step it from what I had here. I need to get a little bit lighter. And wipe off my brush and add more white. I want it to be a little bit lighter than that. There we go. And now I'm gonna dry brush, flicking my brush up off the canvas like a plane taking off the runway. Can you see that motion? So I can create a soft edge between here, but still maintain the shape. I'm gonna do it on the other side too, right over this one. I'm gonna go here and then flick, flick, flick. I'm gonna skewer the rest of this white and then do more dry brushing. So the top half of that teacup, and then I'm gonna get right over it. Again, I'm gonna flick, flick. Clean up the edge here a little bit. And softly go around and fix the edges. Using this small little round brush that I had, I'm going to get rid of the white in the bottom of this teacup. I'm going to ignore the handle for now because I don't think we have time and I don't think it's necessary. It's going to be the same concepts. So I'm going to start with a darker grayish tone. So brown and blue again with my white. Just going to go in and take a look at that foot. And go over some of the shadows I've already created. And then make it a little bit lighter now as I go over to the right. And again, I'm just gently placing the color down without being too nitpicky about detail. I'm gonna rub in a little bit of a highlight right in here with this lighter color. Just rubbing it in because it helps me create a little bit of a highlight without being too overt about it, being a little softer with it. To kind of go up a little bit. Okay, now this is the basic part of the teacup. Now if I want to put in highlights and pattern, what I do is I go in and I say, okay, let's start with pattern. Maybe I've got some of the brown details on the cup. I'm going to take my brown, I'm going to mix a little bit of orange in with my brown for the darkest parts of the pattern because it's kind of a redishy orangey tone. And I'm just going to abbreviate. So I'm not going to like do anything too detailed. I'm just going to say, okay, I see, you know, in the darkest part, there's kind of like a little flower here, and I'm going to dry brush it. I see it kind of comes down the head. There's a stem, and then there's kind of like a branch and a leaf and some other stuff that I don't really know what it is. I'm just going to put some dots and dabs in the shape that I see it. So no real detail. Just kind of getting the general gist of this pattern that I see. There's a little bit of something going on here too, little dots and dabs. Over here, there's some. I'm using the darkest version of this color right now. Almost looks like a bird. And then some other little dots and dabs of color. I'll have to lighten it up in my highlight areas later. But for now, I'm just going to use my darkest value in the main areas that are touching shadow. So again, just some dots and dabs. No real detail. Your brain can fill in what it thinks detail is. I'm just going to squint my eyes and look at the subject matter and say, I see like a little line that goes off that direction and then one that comes down this direction. Then I see a little like dot and dab there. And usually that's enough for the eye to put in, okay, those might be flowers. Inside the teacup too, I'm going to do the same thing. So I see kind of a head of a flower-ish comes down. And then there's parts of it here. And I'm going right over my tea here because this part of the tea, this color is so warm already. So I'll go over my tea area and change the color as needed. once I get it in, just so I know where the pattern is going to be. Sometimes once it hits the T as well, the shape will flatten out a little bit. So a lot of times when you have water or tea or anything impacting a pattern, it'll look a little different below the level of the T. It flattens out, so it's just a bunch, I'm just gonna put a bunch of horizontal lines in there. All right, and it does look like maybe some of these are connecting just a little bit, like maybe there's a little bit more of a leaf kind of a pattern there and there. Good enough. Nice and messy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start lightening up some of these highlighted areas and lightening up the pattern in the teacup too. So I'm going to go back to my filbert brush first, and I'm going to take my, let's get some more white. White is a color you'll use a lot of. And I apologize, I had my brush in my mouth. Something you should never do. I'm going to use a lot of white because especially as I start lightening color, you know, I really need to use a lot of white. It's amazing. So I'll mix a gray and then I'll add white. And if that's too cool, I'll add a touch more brown and then I got to add more white. So I'm going to start getting lighter and lighter with my color. I want more brown. Heck, you know what? It might even just be white and brown at this point. That brown, white cools down the brown so much that I might not even need to add blue to it to make my light cool, or sorry, light warm shadow color. I think I'm liking the way that's looking with just the burnt umber and a bunch of white. And notice how on this palette here, you can see how the color isn't white. It's going to look light on here, but it isn't white. It's a very light gray. I'm going to wipe my brush off a bit, and I'm just going to go around to some of the lighter areas. I'm going to look at my picture and say, okay, where do I need them? They kind of come in around this front area for sure. So I'm going to start laying it down. Again, I'm thinking soft brush marks. I'm definitely seeing it light here. And then flicking the brush up off the canvas like a plane taking off the runway as I come down towards my shadow. So I'm going to put it in. And then start using the dry brush, wipe it off, go around my pattern as well to make sure I get that nice light. Well, I see it come down this way a little bit. So I'm just going to dry brush it in along that edge. Again, turning my arm as necessary to help me get in that part of the pattern. This whole right side here is quite in light, so I'm going to put it all in here and then dry brush it down in as needed. Flicking that brush up off the canvas like a plane taking off the run. I know it's such an annoying saying, but it really, for me, helps convey what it is I'm trying to do to add that light. And I'm just going to go back down here to the bottom center again. I want this to be really light right in front. It's casting some light off of the cup down there. I'm going to put in a nice bit, wipe off my brush, and then start to soften it. Again, just thinking about that plane taking off the runway, going upward and sidewards to kind of give me that nice, warm, light value right around the bottom of this cup. And then soften it up with dry brushing. Same thing in the top of the teacup. I'm going to look at where are my lightest areas. Well, there's definitely, I'm going to use the same flat filbert brush. I'm going to flatten it out. I've got a thick edge and a thin edge here. Actually, I'm going to put it on top of the dark here so you can see it. Depending on how I turn the filbert, thick edge or thin edge, I can still use this to create my rim. Again, just kind of going along in little lines. To start to create my rim of the cup. And I can get lighter again here in a bit too. But for now, I'm just going to go in with this light gray and go everywhere I see it being light along the top edge of this rim, catching the light. And definitely on the inside edge here, I've got to go really softly and flick it into the shadow but I want this whole top edge here to be light. So I'm going to add more white to this color. I'm going to go around my texture here, nice and softly. Just make it much lighter in this top area. Going right around my pattern. And I can always put the pattern back in if I lose some of it by accident. That's no problem. Soften up that a little bit. Now I'm going to start lightening up some of my pattern, and then I'm going to put in the gold before I do the final bit of white. Okay. So to lighten up my pattern, where the light hits it, I'm going to take that mix I had. It was brown with orange mixed in. And I'm going to lighten it up with white. And the minute I add white, I got to think if I need to add a little bit more of that yellow. And I'm going to take that color, and anywhere that it's really in light, I'm just going to go into my pattern and lighten it up a little bit. So right here, maybe some of this part needs to be a little bit lighter. Up in here for sure. I'm going to leave the stuff under the T there because it's fairly similar. I don't think this is a good example of how the color would shift a lot under the T line, but above the T line for sure it's going to be a little bit lighter. So I'll just make it a little bit lighter. Or else is it a little bit lighter? Maybe just this bottom half of this little leaf. And maybe at the bottom parts of this pattern too. I'll put little dots of a lighter value in there. And even lighter, yet again, for just the very brightest parts of this pattern. And now I'm going to go in with my lighter values, so my whites. I'm never going to use pure white right out of the get-go. I'm always going to mix it in a little bit with my grays. So it's still here. I'm going to put a dot here. It's almost white, but it's still not quite white. And now I'm just going to go in and really lighten up the lightest parts. So the lightest parts I see are right here. Definitely down here. I'm going to soften up the edges a bit. I also see that there's a little bit of a light kind of going around. It's a reflected light that has a little bit of a circle pattern in it. That's a reflected light, a shine probably from the teacup. So I'm just going to put that in. Definitely around the edge of the teacup. So still using that smaller filbert, the number 2 filbert, just to put in some of these lighter highlights in the front of this part of the teacup too. And I'm just kissing it in there in places. Oops, if I go too far, I just wipe it off. It's definitely lighter right up in this side. Now let's play with gold real quick. For me, gold is a lot of browns and oranges. So the darkest parts of the gold for me are brown and almost black even in places. So let's say I want a little bit of a rim of gold along here. I'm just going to go in with this mixture of my black. Just put in a thin line. Again, without worrying about perfection, I'm just going to start in the shadowed areas. Same up in here. There's some real value shift between the darks and the lights and golds. I'm just using the thin edge of this brush to sketch it in. It's right on the inside of the rim here, which is kind of unusual. Usually it's on the outer edge of the rim, so that's kind of different. Where else? well, there's also some on the rim, but on that handle, but I'm not going to worry about the handle. So I'm just going to go to my oranges now. So I'm going to use yellow and red with more yellow than red. And I'm going to start looking at where I want some of my highlights to be, and I'm going to start there. So the orange I'm going to put right here. Where else do I want it to be a highlight? I want it to be a little bit highlighted over here and here. And what I'm doing is I'm starting to stair step my golds. Okay, maybe along this whole edge. With a touch of reflected light over here too. So I'm just going to leave a little bit of that gold, orange, clean off my brush, go to my yellow. Now I'm going to do yellow with very little amount of red in it. And maybe a touch of white to help dull it down just a smidge. And now I'm going to go to my highlighted areas again and start to go into the middle of the oranges. And start to make them look a little gold in the center of those little highlighted areas. And obviously I went a little too big here. The mark is a little bit too wide, but that's okay because that's going to glow. So I'm going to do one last little bit. I'm going to take white with a little bit of yellow. I'm going to go right into the center of those areas that I really want it to glow in and make sure they're nice and bright. So right in the center of those areas that I've placed the orange that I really want to be bright, I'm going to go in and put this yellow. And that way, when I want to do the gold, I can take my white, got a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of yellow on it. I'm going to mix it, wipe off my brush really well so it's really dry. And I'm going to start doing a little bit of a gold halo. This is this little bright, vibrant glow of that light. So what I'm doing is I'm dry brushing. I'm taking that just white with a little bit of the yellow in it. I'm going to start doing it where it's dry brushed around it in a circle. That's going to be a little ball of light in the middle of that eventually. So I'm just doing this. And let me use a different color. I'm basically taking it and I'm doing this. I'm creating a soft halo, but with that light yellow and white. Because then when I go into my pure white, oops, now I got a little bit of blue on that brush. Hold on one quick sec. Let me get a clean batch of white. Now, anywhere I want to go in and create a nice bright glow, like on my tea or on the cup itself, I'm going to go in with my white. And I'm going to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to really load it up with white, push and wiggle it in the white. So the paintbrush is loaded with white. Wipe it off on my paper towel really well. So there's almost nothing there. It's still got white in it. I've just wiped it off really well. And again, I can do the same sort of thing. I can just go in with the teacup where there isn't gold and dry brush a little glow. And I'll do a little bit of it in here. A little bit of it here where it's going to glow. I'm going to start glowing up some of this area too. So I'm just going to rub. This whole thing is going to be lighter. And then wherever I did that, I can go into it with my white in the centers of those glowy areas, and I can plop down a nice thick batch of white into it, and it starts to make everything look like it's glows. So it's that combination of hard and soft edges that then give you that glow. I've got to go around the edges of my teacup, and where the tea is, there's usually going to be some highlight. I'm going to put a couple of thick batches of white right in the middle of some of these most vibrant highlights. Put a thick batch, wipe off my brush, and then go in and soften the edge of it. So again, I can scoop up the paint, put it down nice and thick. It can have some texture to it, and then wipe off my brush and soften that edge. Put a couple dots here, more dots along this edge. And then, of course, we've got these really nice thick ones here too that kind of go down into my tea. Again, to get the really nice thick dot of white, I'm going to scoop it up and make it really thick. And then go softly wherever I see just reflected light. Okay. If I want to do a starburst, that's another thing too, because we see some starbursts here. Like there's one right here. So what I'm going to do is wipe off that brush. It's got white on it. I'm going to flick up, flick down, flick to the side, and flick up on angles. And then put a nice big thick dot right in the middle of it. And that gives me a starburst effect of light. Okay. Stop sharing here for a moment. Now, that was just super, super fast, you guys. I'm so sorry. I know it was quick. But just to give you the idea of that layering of dark with the lights on top, doing that dry brushing technique in between, trying to mix on the fly using the power of the white mixed with the grays to give you the warmer, cool grays, the teas and how it layers. I'm going to stop recording now so that my folks here can ask more questions. But if you're watching this after the fact and you have questions, please email me at abanderkaart@gmail.com. Thanks.